So today, I want to talk to you guys about how I became a Christian. In my prior videos, I kind of talked about it, but I wanted to get more in depth of how I became a Christian, kind of like a little bit of my backstory. So let's pretty much dive right into it. So first and foremost, guys, being a Christian simply means, being a follower of Christ, to break it down in a nutshell, right? So my story, is a pretty interesting story, right? We all have our own stories. We all have our own journeys. But my particular story was a little bit different. So I was raised in a church, right? My mom, she was a Christian, since the beginning of my life, since the start of it all. But prior to me being born, my mother, she had a very rough lifestyle. She was in an abusive relationship with my father, my biological dad. My biological father passed away when I was 5, so I don't really have much memory other than maybe like a couple of pictures of him. But my mother, the stories that she used to talk to me about was her days before knowing Christ, right? She dived deep a little bit into witchcraft. She had some witchcraft in her life. My mother, she seemed like, she was always like a gentle woman. She ended up learning about God, and it kind of and I thank God for my mother, right? We always have to thank God, for the ones, that brought us here, pretty much. But no, it was a pretty interesting story. My mom was a Christian, pretty much breaking free from all of that witchcraft and all of that, those spiritual ties, that she used to be a part of. And she broke free from all of those chains and kind of brought God into our lives, while we were here, while we were born. So all of my life, I've always been a Christian. I always heard about Jesus. I always heard about, going to church, being a Christian, all of these things. But, when you're a kid and you grow up into that world, you don't really know what you're really into, right? You just know about God, you hear about God, you hear about all of these things, but you don't really know what it's like to be a Christian, right? Well, like we don't know anything about baptisms, we don't know much about anything, it's just okay, well, I'm here, my mom's a Christian, so I'm a Christian. She talks about Jesus, so I'm going to talk about Jesus, right? So it's a difference, being born into it, having that as a background, but then actually making the decision to actually accept Jesus into your heart, right? It's completely different, right? That's why to me, when babies, they get baptized, in the Catholic religion, I never thought that it made any sense because following Jesus is a personal choice, right? So when you're being baptized, right, that's a personal choice, that you're making. But when you're doing it to a baby or an infant, they're not really making that choice, right? They're just kind of just being brought into that world, right? But anyways, so, I always had that background of being a Christian. I always knew about God, but I just never had that deep relationship, with the Lord like that, right? It wasn't deep like that, I just always knew about it, just growing up. One of the things that I learned about was, the devil, the devil was the bad guy, that there was a hell, there was a heaven, but it was kind of like just background noise, right? I heard of all these things, I'm hearing about all this, I'm living in it, I go to church, but what does it really mean, right? I never understood it. What does it really mean to be a Christian? Why am I a Christian? Why am I not in a different religion? Why was I in this lifestyle and not in a different lifestyle? That's things that you think about when you get older. But pretty much, that was just a routine. We would go to church on Sundays. I started learning about the Holy Spirit, because my mom, when they would be worshiping, she would be jumping up and down. We're kids, so we were, me, my brother, and my sister, we would look and we were laughing because, she's jumping up and down. We're seeing people fall down. We don't understand anything of what's happening, so we're just kind of like, okay, this is the norm. This is just what Christians do. They worship, they praise. Sometimes they're jumping up and down. Sometimes they're falling. People are falling and all this. Okay, this is just what it is. This is just our life, right? So that just became the norm. But yeah, so I was always had that Christian tag, but there was a difference, when I got older, right? You can have anyone can have that Christian tag, as their lifestyle or as as their background, but that personal decision that you make for Jesus to come in is when you truly receive, Christ in your heart. You truly receive the Holy Spirit, and that's when you truly become a Christian. You truly become a disciple, of the Lord. You become like an apostle. You start obeying the Lord. You really start, it gets deeper than just, hearing all of these stories about Noah's Ark and how Moses parted the seas, because as kids, we hear all of these stories all the time, but we don't put the connection together until we start growing spiritually mature. We gain that spiritual maturity. Also, that physical maturity, right? Sometimes it takes longer, for us as human beings, to start gaining that maturity, to start learning and really diving deep into what is it that you're in, right? So, yeah, I've always been a Christian my whole life, always had that background, man. And it wasn't until I was like 21 years old, right? I think I was 21. It was early 20s. Could have been 22, 23, right? So pretty much throughout the course of my life, right? Going to school, right? We were always raised not to, smoke, not to drink, not to be girls. And it wasn't like stamped like, oh, don't do this, don't do that. But we just always had that background of, we just didn't have that interest of doing these things because we were Christian. Right? So because I was a Christian, I had people, that they smoked. I had people that they drank. And we kind of just like, okay, well, yeah, we don't need any of that stuff. We don't want to do it. So we were always kind of labeled like, oh, these guys are kind of weird. They're not doing what everyone's doing. They're kind of just, they think that they're better than us. Right? I would have friends where they're always drinking all the time. And we were, me and my brother, we kind of just strayed away from it. Oh, I don't want to drink. We just never drank. We never found the benefit. And we just thought that it wasn't a good thing to do, right? So that was just the basis, of my life. I didn't even have in my life. I would say that I blossomed very late because of my Christian upbringing, right? When it came to girls, right? I didn't have my first kiss until like way later. I wasn't with a girl until way later. I thought girls were attractive, but I never got into a position where I was, going up to a girl and talking to a girl and having that confidence, to go out with a girl. I didn't have any of that. It was just more so like, oh, women are attractive, girls are attractive. I mean, I had like a first kiss, but it was never anything like that. Kids our age, in high school, middle school, they're already getting girls pregnant. They're doing all of these things. They're drinking, they're smoking, and me and my brother, we just never correlated that lifestyle, with it. Never resonated with us, right? So that was my lifestyle as a Christian. I didn't really understand why I didn't do it. I just knew that it's just not what we do. It's just not a lifestyle, for us. But it wasn't until I got older, right? When I started getting mature, and I got older. I was already out of high school. I was a little bit in college here and there. But it wasn't until like I was like 20, like I said, it was like 21, 22, and maybe 23. Can't get the exact age because I can't remember. But it wasn't until in my early 20s where, I ended up having an actual relationship with someone. And it was kind of hard to say if it was really a relationship because, it was one of those situations, where I was with the individual. It was never really officialized, but we were pretty much like we knew, hey, we're together, But it wasn't until that experience where I really understood how real the Bible was. And I'm going to break it down a little bit real quick, right? So I might do another video on this, completely separate. But, pretty much to sum up this portion of my life, right? I ended up meeting a girl, right? I started engaging in sexual activity with this woman, and we were fornicating. I was with her. She had kids. All of these things. It wasn't until that era of my life, meeting her and dealing with her dealing with my first heartbreak was when I started really understanding the reality of God, the spiritual warfare, angels, demons, all of that. That was that specific era where I realized that life was more than what I saw. So to make a long story short, as I said, I'm going to make a separate video about this, but, being with this individual, right, I learned so much, right? She had, as I said, she had kids. This individual, unfortunately, she was not Christian. She was, she drank, she smoked, she did drugs, she lived a completely different lifestyle. But me being so young and me being so inexperienced, I fell for this girl. I fell for her personality. I fell for her vulnerability. I fell for a lot of things that I felt like, hey, I like this individual. We have a slight history, and I love, the way that she laughed, but I don't know. There was something about her, that I just wanted to just continue, to get to know. I wanted to be with her. And yeah, pretty much one thing led to another. I was engaging in fornication, which is clearly something I should not have been doing, right? So I was creating a soul tie with this individual, right? And this soul tie that I was creating, eventually, it allowed me, to have strong feelings for this individual. So I had strong feelings for this individual. I fell for her very fast. And it kind of turned out into like a relationship situation type of thing. But in this relationship, we were not equally yoked, right? She wasn't getting me closer to God, right? I wasn't getting her closer to God. There was no God in the center of any of this. This was me being inexperienced, me being immature, and me just kind of just living life. That's really what I was doing. I just fell for this girl. I loved her personality. She made me laugh. She was always laughing, so I just fell for her. But over time, as I'm with her, at the same time, she had kids. So I was being like a stepdad, not knowing anything of what I'm doing. I just like the girl. So I'm at a point where I'm like, all right, well, I like her. I'm willing to do anything for her, right? This individual, ended up cheating on me. She ended up there was just so much. She was smoking cigarettes. She was doing a whole bunch of things that I didn't like, but I still stayed because I caught, quote unquote feelings for her. But to make a long story short, at the end of the relationship and me actually, wanting to let her go, me pretty much initiating, letting her go, there was a lot of spiritual things that started happening, a lot of supernatural things that were happening while I was with her, and even towards the end of the relationship. And God brought me into that era of my life, for a specific reason, and this reason was to open up my eyes to the reality of the spiritual warfare that we encounter every day, right? So as I said, I'll make a separate video about this individual because I feel it's a very important testimony. But, to make a long story short, this woman, I've come to find out that she was demon possessed. Okay? Now, a lot of you are thinking like, whoa, demon possessed. What is this guy talking about? Is this guy talking about The Exorcist? So I kid you not, guys. This woman, there was so much signs, while I was with this individual, so much spiritual battle, spiritual warfare. There were so many things going on. I was just unaware of the spiritual warfare while I was with her. But I came to realize, that this woman had multiple demons inside of her, right? So if we look at scripture, right, Jesus talks about there's many times where he casted demons out of people. Now, me growing up, I've always heard about these things, but I never took into account the reality of the scriptures and how real it is until I went through it myself. So long story short, this woman had demons inside of her. I saw when they manifested. I saw, when they came out of this individual. And and you guys, it scared the crap out of me. It really did. This was a situation, that when all of these things were happening, the drinking, the suicidal attempts, the manifestation of these spiritual entities, these things that I'm just seeing and witnessing. Guys, it was an eye-opener. It scared me so much, and the heartbreak that I had for this individual, because me growing up in the church, I realized, that they used to talk about these things, and we used to hear about the devil, we used to hear about the demons, but when it came into my reality, in my early 20s, as I said, it was an eye-opener, right? It was like God brought me, through that, to allow me to understand the reality of the spiritual warfare that's happening. So it wasn't until that very moment, all of those things that I went through, right, that made me draw closer to God more so than ever. My reality completely shifted, right? A lot of people, we live in this earth, right? It's very basic, right? We just live on the surface of things, right? We just wake up, right? We go to work, we go to school, sometimes on weekends we have fun, people go drink, people go dancing, and that's it. People don't really think about the reality of life, the reality of the spiritual realm that exists, the reality of eternity. So when I was going through these things with this individual, the first thing that I, after I broke up with her, and after that crazy traumatic experience, that I had with her, one of the first things that I did was I wanted to read scripture, or I wanted to read a book, books that related, to what I went through, because in my head I'm thinking, like, there's no way that I can be the only person that has gone through all of these things. It's just not possible, right? So I ended up, getting a Christian book, and this Christian book was called He Came to Set the Captives Free. I think it was by Rebecca Brown. I read that book, and that book was a story about a witch and a doctor, and how God, intervened, into those ladies' lives. It was an amazing story, but a lot of those stories backed up, it was backed up, with scriptures, and it was a story, about, it was a Christian story, about, and it was pretty much revealing, the devil's tactics and how demons operate. And when I read that book, it pretty much confirmed with me, what I went through. So it wasn't until that very moment, where I truly, started understanding, the reality of this life, the reality of the scriptures in the Bible. And that's when I really, truly started becoming a Christian. It wasn't my upbringing, right? Because anyone can have an upbringing, of a Christian tag in their background. But it wasn't until that point, that I saw the reality of this life, and I wanted to draw closer to God. I wanted to have a deeper relationship with my Lord. So that's pretty much my story, guys. That is how I became a Christian. Now, this video, as I said, it's not going to be a super long video. I just wanted to explain to you guys, that I got to that point where I said, hey, I want to get closer to God. I want to develop a relationship with the Lord. I want to know how Satan operates. All of these things. And that is how I drew closer to God. And that's how I truly became a Christian, with that experience. I started understanding more about, accepting Jesus, into my heart, But anyways, guys, like I said, I just wanted to make a quick video. That's pretty much, the basis of how I became a Christian, how I became closer to God. I'm going to make more videos, on this topic. I might make a part 2 to this. But, once again, guys, if you liked, me getting personal with you guys and like tuning into my story and my testimonies, or if you could relate to it, or if you just want to learn more, please like and subscribe, guys. Subscribe to my videos, so you can see more and I can create more content with you guys. Enjoy the rest of my UFC 5 videos, and I will see you guys in the next one.
Right there, DC, he's rocked. That was a beautiful hook. It landed perfectly, and it hurted his shoulder very bad. Big knee to the body. Well, we've seen a lot of... These guys are both throwing everything with fight-ending intentions.
Jon's nose is bleeding now, so we'll see how he handles that adversity, but nothing ideal about it here in the middle of this fight. Final seconds here in round one. Oh, nice job to catch the leg. He saw that strike coming and now works it into a takedown. So now he has the fight to the canvas. Let's see what he can do with it. All right, so the round is over, and you see some obvious bleeding now. Looks like the cut is on the nose. Yes, it is. Cutman will try to get in there and shut it, but of course, as soon as he absorbs the strike. All right, so there's the horn signifying the end of the round. We had a knockdown there, but not a knockout.
You ready to fight? Ready.
All right, round two. Oh, he lands another strike to the body, really starting to connect on a lot of shots to the midsection, and these will take their toll as this fight goes into the latter rounds. Straight punch, Houston. Rosas Jr.'s lower jaw now starting to show signs of swelling. All right, good job by him there to raise the guard and back to his feet. Big right hand lands. Left punch followed by a right. Nice 1-2 there by Jan.
When Piotr lets his hands go, man.
Sight to behold.
Yeah, he's fast. So fast.
Well, that smile on his face is only going to be surpassed